Welcome to the Canadian Party of Quebec podcast. On today's episode, co-leaders Myrtis Fossey and Colin Standish are joined by Keith Henderson, former Equality Party of Quebec leader and CaPQ board member.
Why should the average person care?
Because their rights are affected.
Tell me more about that.
Let's say the Quebec government gets away with it, and suddenly Quebec is officially French. Right now, you have the right to have a trial. If you happen to be an Anglophone, you have a right to have a trial in English. And the judges have to understand the English. And if they don't, then judges have to be selected for the trial who do understand the English. That's part of Canadian law, the constitutional framework of Canada. In Quebec, the official languages are English and French. And it's very important to define what an official language is. An official language is a language in which all the laws have to be written. So right now, in Quebec, if you pass a law, the law has to be written in both English and French. And by extension, you have the right as an English-speaking person to be heard in a trial in English. If the existing amendment to the Constitution is accepted, suddenly you lose that right. And it becomes only French. And you don't, if you appear in front of a trial, civil procedure, whatever, you don't have the right to have your hearings done in English. That's very important.
And I guess this would apply to education and to, postal service and to medical services and emergency services. All these things would suddenly no longer be guaranteed available in English?
Well, we have to be careful about the law, because when you define an official language, you're defining it in, unfortunately, restrictive terms. So an official language defined in Canada is what I said. Laws have to be written in both English and French, and you're guaranteed the right to have a trial or a court proceeding in English and French. But because you have that protection in the Canadian Constitution, it doesn't extend necessarily to, say, a hospital. It doesn't. The law is extremely categorical in Canada. There are certain provincial areas of jurisdiction where they can do X and Y and Z, and in other areas they're not allowed. But the chief area which is affected by the amendment to the Constitution, which the Quebec government says it's able to do, is hearing trials in English and French in the province.
I see.
But it doesn't extend to everything.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. That clarifies, yeah.
There's a clarification as well that there's the McDonald case, which it's kind of comical that people drove around Montreal very quick to see if you get a ticket first and challenge it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so they actually, it's quite fascinating for criminal proceedings in Quebec and then the rest of Canada. You have the absolute right, English and French, to be understood, or, and for, both parties, everything must be translated. For civil suits, it's actually sort of a Tower of Babel. You could speak English at the court. The judge could only speak French to you. The other party could speak English or French, and the judgment could be, let's say, everything went in English. So, the plaintiff, the defendant, and the judge all spoke English. He could actually write it in French or English. So it's at their choice. So there is ambiguity there. We do have the right to English or French, but not always at our choice for civil suits in Quebec. Just there is some weird ambiguity there. Just to jump off what Keith said, but on a very important aspect that Keith touched upon is what cannot be gotten away with, and we don't know that answer, right? It seems that Quebec's constitutional vandalism is to create ambiguity, because if Quebec is a nation, I'll read the amendment that is now in our constitution right now. It's Quebecers form a nation. French shall be the only official language of Quebec. It is also the common language of the Quebec nation. So, what they had interpretation, right? And now that's inserted into C13, and it has predominance over all other laws in Quebec, and using the notwithstanding clause to subrogate rights and freedoms in the Quebec and Canadian charters, that suddenly this amendment determines everything in Quebec. It distorts and perverts the entirety of our law, access to services, etc. So if it's not struck down over time, as I think as Julius Gray said when it came out in 2021, Bill 96, This is independence on the installment plan. It creates a separate society and rule of law, different rules and regulations for Quebec that no other province has in Canada. And of course, if you can amend the Constitution willy-nilly, what's to say Quebec can't say it no longer applies to Quebec, which they done with the Oath Act. So it's just a accretion of powers that you could just say, okay, this no longer applies, and you can amend the Constitution willy-nilly. I think it's a very clever plan on behalf of the Quebec government. And if it's not pushed back upon, there's no reason that you could not have an amendment to the Canadian Constitution by a province if there was some sort of yes vote or whatever they would do for a third referendum potentially that could lead to the separation of Quebec legally. And Keith knows a lot more about this than I do, but this I think is the intentional plan. You can separate Quebec within Canadian rule of law because the federal government has not pushed back upon this. This is speculation, but I think it's quite brilliant. In 20, 30 years, if there was a crisis, they could legitimately and legally, quote unquote, separate Quebec from the rest of Canada. And no one would be able to stop them.
Let me comment on that. That's what they tried to do, they being the government of Quebec. At the time it was separatist. That's what they tried to do in 2000 as a response to the Clarity Act. They passed a law. It's got a big long title, but call it Bill 99. That's the short version of it. Basically saying exactly what Colin just said. It was an attempt to define the powers of a referendum in Quebec to enable them to secede at will. They declared in that law that Quebec and Quebec alone was the determining government for the constitutional future of the province. I personally, took that law to court. And as an aside, it's important to point out the deficiencies of individual citizens taking laws to court. It took 20 years for that law to be adjudicated, 20 years. And the federal government could have taken that law and put it in front of the Supreme Court instantly and got a decision within 6 months. This way, counting on citizens to protect their rights subjects them to the delays of the law, and in this case, it was egregious. But leave that aside. It took 20 years, and finally the courts ruled, no, this law does not give Quebec the right to secede unilaterally, even though they basically said it did. They said the only thing that you can do with this law is change the internal provincial constitution. You cannot affect the constitution of the country, and you certainly cannot use it to declare independence unilaterally. That was stated in the judgment. Very important victory that was stated. In fact, it was stated, but it was also stated by what I would call a kind of nationalist judge. Yes, you can't use that law to declare independence unilaterally. You're not allowed to do that. However, it's important to note that if the negotiations in the process don't succeed, maybe you can. However, the Court of Appeal in Quebec looked at that again and said, no, this only affects provincial jurisdiction. And if the law is used in an unconstitutional manner, it is not constitutional and it won't pass muster. So it was really a victory. It was very good. It took 20 years to get the decision. It was very good. It was taken to court because it restricted the meaning of that law considerably.
Yeah.
And so what should we do? How do we, either Keith or Colin or both, what do we do now? I mean, they're just playing, wild cards here in terms of the Constitution. The Clarity Act doesn't seem to be so clear. There's a lot of problems here. What's going to happen to Quebec? What's going to happen to Canadians? What do we need to know?
Yeah. The first step, I think, here is to raise the alarm bells for all Canadians and Quebecers. And so that's what we're trying to do here today, because it's not a little note, and I haven't seen the mainstream media, but that the federal government has acquiesced to illegitimate provincial amendments to the Constitution. A very big deal for everybody, whether you agree with them or not. And then secondly is, what we're going to do about it, whether there's legal recourses, et cetera. I'm working with some to determine a plan of action, but first everyone just needs to be informed. And as well, I think everyone should take away from it. This is a federal government. This is our federal government doing so. This is as well the Liberal Party of Canada, traditionally defended bilingualism, human rights, in a unified country. Majority of them, key members of cabinet, and I think almost, I think all seats in the island of Montreal, save one or two, are Liberal Party of Canada MPs who sometimes say different things in private and at church basements. But once again, when they're voting on it, that they are not just complicit with the diminishment of rights and freedoms in Quebec. They are complicit in helping Quebec actually tarnish our foundational documents. So we need to call them to account. Our members of Parliament, Anthony Housefather, Anna Gainey, Mary Claude Bibeau in the Eastern Townships, Pascal St. Ange. We need to call them to account if they represent communities which are majority or plurality of non-Francophone Quebecers and proudly Federalist Francophones. So raise the alarm bells, figure out a plan of action, which we should all need to work on. And then thirdly, call our elected officials federally to account. They can stop this, but they are allowing it to happen.
And of course, at the Canadian Party of Quebec, we're extremely motivated and devoted to doing all of those things. First, by informing people like how we're doing today and how we've done in press releases of various sorts. But also we've been to Ottawa and we've asked, and we'll continue asking the federal government to stop being lazy about these things and to start standing up for our rights. I know I've been really wanting to make a move on this and wanting to invite other people to join our party, to join this movement, to help us figure out the next steps for Quebec and Canada. And I think everyone in this conversation today would agree.
Absolutely. Let me just add about alarm bells and how it works. Of course, if you say nothing, then these very sneaky moves done by the federal government just pass into law, and no one's the wiser. If you have a bunch of people like Colin, like yourself, Myrtis, raising the alarm bell, this is what happens. Nobody, for example, for the past year or two, was speaking about the federal power of disallowance. The federal government has a veto power over any provincial legislation, can use it any time it wishes. The power of disallowance. It could have been used when the provincial government here in Quebec introduced those amendments, that the power of disallowance could have been invoked. No one was talking about it except people inside the Canadian Party of Quebec. Because we talked about it, suddenly it appeared in major articles by a respected journalist, Andrew Coyne, who has a national audience. He wrote about it in the Globe and Mail just recently, more than once, raising the power of disallowance which the federal government possesses. I believe, I won't say it's entirely because of the Canadian Party of Quebec, because other people have raised their voices along these lines too. If you raise the alarm, other people follow suit. And gradually, if you do it, you can get change. That's what we want, ultimately, to affect change. And we won't do it with silence.
So if I understand you correctly, Keith, what we need to do is we need to be the first people out on the dance floor, and then everybody will join us.
There you go.
Let's dance. But
This has been
we
a
can
great
certainly,
conversation.
yeah, we can certainly talk about this, Keith and I think we'll come back to it, but everyone, just for our listeners and Canadian Party members and all interested Canadians, that this is a really big deal. We all need to tune into this. It needs to be front page news across the country. So let's make it famous. Let's dance.
The Canadian Party of Quebec is a principled federalist voice for the future of Quebec. For more information, visit CanadianPartyQuebec.ca.